truth to power, but I really want to assure you all that I didn't do it after Dr. Imboden's remarks, I swear.
You told me the same thing.
So I definitely did not do that. But anyway, the research problem that I want to start with today that motivated my research is what we've seen in the last, in the last decade or so, is a significant growth in the amount of intelligence studies research properly and intelligence-related research. And I think that it's probably not very controversial to say that much of this research is quite probably applicable and relevant to the world of practitioners. And I think that over the last couple days, we've seen this. My notes. So I think this poses an interesting research problem. If we have a large supply out there, and perhaps the demand is not as great as perhaps academics imagine it to be, but if there's a large supply of research, and there's applicability to that research, it raises, I think, some important questions about the relationship between academic knowledge, so knowledge produced in the ivory tower, and as well as the world of practice. And so, looking at this research problem, I derived a few questions that I wanted to try to answer with the paper that I wrote. So, the first question that I wanted to know is, what are the different ways that practitioners use academic knowledge? And given that, why is some academic research used by practitioners, but others perhaps is not? And so what I wanted to do that's a little different perhaps than maybe some of the work that's out there is I wanted to try to extend the excellent research that we have available in international relations as well as intelligence studies. And I wanted to bring in this research area called knowledge utilization. And it's kind of like intelligence studies in that it has no real home. But it's definitely influenced most by policy studies, which is my own home discipline. And so I wanted to bring in the theories, the frameworks, and the findings from this literature. And so what I want to do today is I kind of want to, quoting Scott Page, the systems complexity theorist, I want to take a big box of puzzle pieces and just dump them on this table and provide a bunch of framework, provide some variables or factors to the audience here, in the hopes that perhaps we can start to understand better a question that was asked yesterday by one of our participants, which was, do we have any evidence of intelligence-related research being used for practitioners? And so that's the primary approach that I'm trying to take. Now, what I basically am going to argue today is that, and again, this is an early form argument, is that knowledge use, so the use of academic research by practitioners in intelligence-related roles, and when I say practitioners, I mean that in a very broad sense, is cumulative and hierarchical, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And furthermore, it's affected by very complex processes of different variables that line up different ways. And what I wanted to do today was I wanted to show what I call like a mini case study. I wouldn't call this a case study in the true sense of case study research literature, but to give you an idea of how these types of theories and frameworks can be applied to the world of intelligence research. So the first thing that I'm going to start with is to lay out my argument is one model to look at practitioner use of academic research is to think about it as a ladder. This originally comes from scholars from knowledge utilization, specifically policy studies, Wildofsky and Knott. And they pretty much argued that the way that knowledge is used by practitioners or out in the world of practice is it's cumulative or hierarchical. So At the lower level of knowledge use, you have simple awareness. So a practitioner may simply be aware of, say, social science theory from Malcolm Gladwell, perhaps. Building on top of that is more of a deeper understanding of knowledge produced by academics. So what's interesting is we look at the knowledge utilization literature. There was one study in particular by Landry et al. Where they looked at, they asked Canadian social scientists, what percentage of them do you think said that their work was read by practitioners, at least their work had gotten to the awareness level? What do you think? 50, 60%? It's actually quite high. It was 70%. So, but it's also significant too because about 30% are not even getting onto this ladder. Moving further up to the higher levels, we get into Enlightenment. And what this rung means is it's when knowledge starts to affect the framework through which practitioners view the world. And what's really interesting is there was a study that was done by Avi and Dash, and so this is in international relations research, and they found that about 85% of the national security respondents that they surveyed said that social science research provides intellectual background or a common knowledge. And this is indicative of enlightenment. Okay? Moving up to action, this is the highest level. So when I think a lot of academics think about how their research could be used, I think this is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about the research being used instrumentally for some kind of, to change some kind of policy, procedure, and so on. And then lastly, off the ladder, we have symbolic uses. And symbolic uses are ones that we often see in the news. So if you ever see a politician cite a particular study that supports their point of view, that would be indicative of a symbolic or political use because they're using the research to basically legitimize a position they already have. So you might be asking what's the difference between, say, enlightenment and symbolic or political use, and the thing is it is quite a blurry line. And I'll be happy during the Q&A to discuss different ways that knowledge utilization scholars have looked at and tried to answer these types of questions and measure knowledge utilization. So we've looked at how academic research is used, but then there's the why question. Why would certain research be used as opposed to others? And so I went in and tried to synthesize what I could from the knowledge utilization literature, and I kind of put them into these three general categories. And there's more, but these are the ones that I thought were the most relevant. So the first one is the social explanation. So we can understand knowledge utilization based on the quantity and quality of interactions between practitioners and academics. This is a good example of that. We're trying to bring in practitioners and academics. Okay? Then we can think about it at the product level. What is the actual research that's being delivered? Is it tailored to meet the demands of policymaking? Is it understandable to a common audience outside of academia? And then lastly, we have the organizational context. So now we're zooming out to the organization that the practitioner sits in. One of the things I learned in a study that I did of State Department INR is that there is a certain perspective on how analysis should be done that's based on the institutional culture there. And that affects the uptake of knowledge there. Okay. So looking at my mini case study, I looked at the cognitive biases research and intelligence studies, or I'm sorry, intelligence analysis. And so probably most people in here are familiar, but a Cliff Notes version of what it is for those of you that haven't, is that this line of research was really developed mainly in the 1970s by Kahneman and Tversky. And the researchers wanted to understand the ways that individuals reason in rational terms, usually in the context of probability theory. And what they found is that oftentimes the respondents in the lab would struggle because they would use, unhelpful heuristics in order to make their judgments, and they would commit what are called cognitive biases. So really quickly, what's interesting, and I will kind of, since I think I'm running short on, well, I have a couple more minutes, but one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the the process of the cognitive biases research implementation into U.S. intelligence analysis, and really now even more globally, you see that it really began with intelligence officer Lanier Zvi approaching Daniel Kahneman and saying to him, what can we use from decision analysis? And this is in the 1970s, after the Yom Kippur War. What can we do to prevent surprise? What can we do to improve the decision-making process for the Israeli government? And they ran into some roadblocks in terms of the report that they generated. However, if you want to look at that from a knowledge utilization perspective, you can see that role of the research perspective. That the product necessarily was not translatable to the Israeli leadership, because it was the Israeli leadership was presented with subjective probabilities from Kahneman and Zvi's experiment, and that it was unsatisfying to those decision makers. So if we look at the implementation of cognitive biases research, it really comes down to a conversation. Conversation probably not too dissimilar from the types of conversations you're having out when you have coffee. In fact, in 1977, Richard Hoyer, a very important intelligence studies scholar practitioner, was approached by that same intelligence officer at the ISA conference in '77. And it was that Israeli officer that got Hoyer thinking about the cognitive biases research. And as many of you probably know, there's a very important book, it's very well known perhaps, especially among practitioners, The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. And that was Hoyer's project over many years, where he basically translated the results of the cognitive biases research that was developing in the 1970s and early 1980s. What's really interesting, I think, is then Hoyer not only put it into understandable terms. So if you ever get a chance to look at that book, it's very intuitive. At the same time, too, he also put cognitive biases research in the context of structured analytic techniques. And that made them more actionable. And that's something that's potentially quite useful to practitioners. Because he's saying, in effect, I can help you address these cognitive biases. Now, of course, it's another question as to how effective they are. And then, of course, the basis of the literature itself. Since I'm running short on time, I just want to conclude. So I have a conclusion, but I have to admit, I'm still working it out a little bit. I do see, given these different perspectives on knowledge utilization, I see some opportunities for academics. So speaking to the academics in the room, just for this. So, I think that you can't downplay the importance of building personal connections between academics and practitioners to create the kind of connections necessary to potentially spread knowledge. At the same time, too, and I'm going to make a shout out to the Bridging the Gap project, there's some great opportunities out there for scholars to learn and to build these connections. So one is the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship. In addition, I mentioned the Bridging the Gap project. It's hosted in American University. It provides a summer seminar to academics to help them with policy writing and opportunities for engaging practitioners.